Welcome to Sermon Q&A. I'm Pastor Alex, and I'm here in the studio with Pastor Craig. And on February 13th, 2022, we preached the last sermon in our series on John the Baptist, the greatest man who ever lived. And coming from that sermon, we have a question. Pastor Craig, this is a question for you. Does the Bible actually teach that I should find joy in everything?
Good question, Alex.
I'm very excited for this, by the way.
So this comes from a couple of different verses in the New Testament that we quote a lot.
Yep.
And so they're familiar. And the other reason we quote them a lot is because they're short. Here's what they say. Philippians 4:4 says, "Rejoice in the Lord always. And again, I say, rejoice."
Yeah, okay.
Right? So just in case you missed
right.
it, he's not being redundant. He said, rejoice
All the time,
always.
right? Everything, yeah.
And in case you missed it again, I'm going to say it, rejoice always, right?
Yeah, right.
Same thing.
Yeah.
And then we hear it again in 1 Thessalonians 5:16. It's simply two words, rejoice always.
Okay.
And the next verse is pray without ceasing.
Oh, that's
pray
it.
always.
That's
rejoice
the answer.
always.
There you go. We're
right?
done, right?
But
Okay.
it is very difficult to find joy in everything because we live in a fallen world. And so we have to define what we mean by joy. So first of all, there's a drastic difference between joy and happiness. Happiness is temporal, fleeting, right? I'm happy when my children behave. I'm very, very aware of the fact that that won't last long, right? So there's a temporary happiness that occurs.
Yeah.
I'm happy when, something goes well at work, but it may not tomorrow. Mm-hmm. So there's a happiness that occurs, but it's temporary. Joy is deeper. And when the Bible talks about this joy, it talks about almost a condition of our soul that we enter into when we start a relationship with Jesus Christ, so that in a very weird and supernatural way, God gives us the ability to find joy in every circumstance.
Yeah.
Now, you're a pastor and I'm a pastor. We've been into a lot of difficult circumstances in people's lives. They invite us into really transparent, vulnerable spaces, and they go through a lot of pain and suffering. We get to be invited in that. And I look at them and I'm going, how in the world can you go through this?
Yeah.
How can you deal with it? I've stood at the crib of a 2-year-old who ended up with tubes hanging out of her because she's clinging on for life because she'd been abused by her child care worker. And her parents are standing there and they're looking at me. They're going, how could God ever allow this to happen? And I'm looking at them. I'm not going to say, you know what? Rejoice always.
You should just be joyful.
And again, I say rejoice.
Yeah.
It doesn't work that way. But there is a joy that we can have knowing that no matter what the fallenness of this world we're experiencing is, God's will is still going to be done.
Yeah.
There's a deeper satisfaction that comes because we have an eternal perspective. It's not a temporary happiness, but an eternal perspective. So rejoice in the Lord always literally means rejoice in the Lord. There's a part of that we kind of we love the rejoice.
Right. Yeah. Just be joyful, right?
But it's important that we realize that God is working out a plan according to his will, and we can rejoice in that.
Yeah. It has a location. Your joy has a place that it needs to be put. It's not just generally be joyful, but be joyful in something specific.
Right.
The Lord.
So John the Baptist, we did the sermon yesterday, the greatest man who ever lived. Well, he ended his life pretty crummy.
Yeah.
He's spent a year in the dungeon, right? He's thrown in there because the wife of Herod liked listening to him, but the wife of Herod didn't
like him. Yeah.
So he said, shut that man up. And Herod said, well, I'm not going to kill him. So they throw him in the dungeon and he's there for a year. He goes in before Jesus does any miracles and in public miracles, any of his public preaching, any of that. John literally is in line for the greatest movie that ever came up. He's got his little tent and his little chair, and he's out there for 24 hours. He's going to have the best seat in the house. And all these people are gathered behind him, waiting to get into the same show.
They all go in first.
The door opens, and they all walk over him. They get in there.
And he doesn't.
The door's shut, and they lock. And he's going, I've told 1 million people about this movie, and I'm not going to get to see it. And then he ends up in this dungeon, and I can't imagine the confusion and the despair and we see it a little bit because he actually sends his disciples to Jesus. He says, are you the one we should be waiting for, or should we be waiting for somebody else?
Yeah.
And then to lose his life the way that he did, puts his head on the chopping block And I can't imagine the confusion in this man's head. He's probably thinking, the kingdom is supposed to be set up. I'm supposed to get rescued by Jesus. What in the world is going on?
What's going on? Yeah.
And yet, I have to say that even then, joy did not escape this man's heart, because he was able to see everything that he goes through on a different level, knowing that God's will is being accomplished. And that's why I think Jesus answered the way that he did. Yeah. The blind see, the lame walk, and all of these things. This we talked about this before, the seed that falls on the different soils of the heart, and some of that soil, the plant sprouts up, and then the cares of this world and actually the tribulation and trials, Jesus says, choke out that faith. I think that means that our faith has to be deep enough where we find that joy deep down, so that no matter what goes on, we know that God's will is being accomplished. Yeah. We can't have joy in temporary things. We have to have joy in the eternal things that we know God is doing. Jesus himself, greatest example, I think, is he's going to the cross. Clearly in the Garden of Gethsemane, anybody passing by would go, that man is not joyful. Right? He's crying, he's sweating, he's praying to God that this doesn't happen. Yep. But yet in Hebrews, it tells us in Hebrews 12:2, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who now listen to this, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. Again, I think there's a depth that Jesus knew God's will is being accomplished. He's not happy.
Right.
He's clearly not happy.
Right. Yeah.
But he's joyful because he knows the end product of him going to the cross is that he gets to present, he gets to present the bride of Christ, his bride, to the Father. Yeah. Like, this is what my death has accomplished, my death and resurrection.
That's good.
So I think we find joy when we let God be God, and we go through our despair, and it's going to hurt, and it's going to be painful, and it's going to be confusing. But don't let the despair control you. Let God be God, and work on a deeper level where you can find joy even when you look at a situation and go, I'm not happy.
Okay, so you're telling me that it might be unhelpful for me when I see perhaps a brother or sister who is being intensely persecuted for their faith, or somebody who is struggling with like one of the biggest losses of their life. It might be unhelpful for me to say, well, in Jesus, we're all supposed to just be joyful.
I would say that would be unhelpful.
That would be unhelpful. Okay, I just wanted to clarify that. That's really good.
I mean, like we talked about before, your comment was, we speak the truth. We reaffirm our faith. We convict ourselves again of the truth that God's promises are going to remain and will come true and come to pass. And those kinds of things help us through the despair. They help us cling to our joy.
All the promises of God and Jesus are yes and amen, right? Like that's what we need to cling to. That's
I also like what Pastor Michael says a lot. He says, if you know what God knows, you do what God does every time. And that kind of helps us through the moments of despair that we go through, to hold on to a deeper joy. It's not fleeting happiness. It's just a satisfaction, a joy that whatever happens around us in this fallen world, God's still got the controls.
Amen. Well, Pastor Craig, thank you so much for answering that question. And we invite you to stick around for more questions on Sermon Q&A.